Hello, everybody. This is Dr. Adam Rindy, and this is the One Thing podcast. And I'm really delighted to welcome on my guest today, Jim LaValle. Nice to meet you, and nice to have you on with us.
It's great to be on. Looking forward to this. We've worked hard at getting this together.
We have. I think I really appreciate your flexibility. I know you're extremely busy, and thank you for working with me to make this happen.
Sure.
So I think just to kind of set up our conversation today, we are going to speak about a topic that is top of mind, in a lot of circles right now, which is neuroinflammation. It just is a topic that affects so many people, and especially aging populations, ADHD populations, anxiety, mental health disorders, Parkinson's disease. I mean, the list goes on. So it's going to be a very interesting topic to learn from you and your unique background. I always like to speak with people who have a different background than me because it just brings so much more richness to the conversation.
Great. Yeah, it's a great topic.
So why don't we sort of get to know you a little bit? There we go. From a standpoint of getting to know you, I'm going to sort of just love to hear like the moment that you sort of entered into regenerative medicine and functional medicine. How did that come about?
Wow. Well, that was 1983, actually. So I have been doing this work now since really full time since about 1985. I was bodybuilding. I was going through pharmacy school, pushing myself hard, won this national qualifier, and I felt like crap. I felt terrible. And I was graduated out of school, and I went to a chiropractic doc who was doing a lot of nutritional work because my cousins actually were importing dietary supplements and homeopathic medicines from Germany via the Soroil group and the Reckwig group. And so I talked to them, and they referred me over to this guy. And I'm like this really smart kind of young pharmacist, just graduated, and the pharmacy school I went to was actually founded by Lloyd Brothers. So we had a rich history. I took botanical medicine. So I took botany courses. I took compounding, took organic medicinal chemistry. So I was kind of into it anyway, but I went to this doc, he put me on a program, and it changed my life. I mean, I felt incredible. I mean, I woke up and literally I lasted behind the pharmacy counter about, I don't know, maybe a year. And I just made the decision that I wanted to do this work of really helping people to figure out what they needed to take to maintain their best health possible. And that set me on that path. And, 22 books, 4 databases, 16 ebooks later, and probably had the largest clinic in the country doing this work back in Cincinnati. I'm still passionate about it because I think we still have so much to learn about how we can help people to really unravel the complexity of the troubles they get into with their health. So it was really a personal journey. I mean, I wasn't feeling well and reached out to feel better, just like all of us do.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And then on your, sort of journey with that, did you come across any teachers that really you resonated with, or any books, or
Sure.
sort of a moment where you kind of connected with someone who, that really resonated with?
I had 2 mentors who have passed since. One was Dr. David Poland, who was that chiropractor who I ended up working with. And we would process 600 people a week doing personalized plans in his practice. So I cut my teeth in one of the biggest practices in the country. And then my biggest influence was probably Dr. Alexander Wood, who was the founder of the Ontario College of Naturopathic Medicine. And so I would go up to Canada, up into the greater Toronto area, Richmond Hill, actually. And I learned under Sandy Wood all about homotoxicology. And of course, the classic books of Reckwig, and homotoxicology, Pissinger's work on the ground matrix and connective tissue regulation. These were big, I would say, driving forces for me, understanding that if you looked at it from Reckwick's perspective, that as people get sicker, and this is a guy writing 40, 50 years ago, right? So we got to remember that. He's talking about mitochondrial disruption and how the more we get sick, the more we create more oxidative damage, the more we uncouple our ability to have ox-phos relationships in the cell, the more diseased we get to the point where we become, getting dedifferentiated cells. So those were really the big, I'd say, things that moved me. Was my mentors who happened to be, a chiropractor and a naturopath chiropractor, even though I was a clinical pharmacist and taught at medical school, ended up teaching at medical school for, 15 years and 17 years in pharmacy. Mm-hmm. I fully valued that side of healthcare and that side of medicine. So those were the big movers for me.
It's interesting. I see over your left shoulder the book, The COX-2 Connection.
Yes.
And I remember picking up that book in, I think, my first or second year of medical school. It was sitting. You must have been there to speak at the
right
the campus, and there was some copies sitting around, and I was blown away to understand those mechanisms of how plants can balance inflammation, and
much safer way, by the way.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you hardly hear the term COX-2 very often anymore. Back then it was like all over medicine, and to the fact that we you pointed out things like turmeric, and it was mind opening for me, and also encouraging to know that you can actually really get deep into the mechanisms of natural medicine and understand how they work versus more of this sort of practice where we're just more kind of talking about broad sweeping actions.
Yeah, I think that gets dangerous. That starts to be like allopathic application of natural products, right? Like, here's your protocol. And I'm obviously I'm the educational co-chair at A4M. I'm big on educating physicians. I really want them to understand what is going on in their body. What is the systems biology dysfunction that's going on? And as our topic today, neuroinflammation, it's at the center of everything. I mean, they're big issues, whether you're a diabetic or you've got a chronic neurodegenerative disorder or it's a mood disorder, it's sitting there. And so I think, it's really important that when you understand how things work, you can understand what tool to apply to correct it. But if all you do is have this kind of top line knowledge and think you're going to get this protocol and just stamp it out for everybody, I don't know. I think we're better than that. I think we want to really strive to be more than that.
Yeah, and I've seen some of your work with like the metabolic code work and how you have really looked at how the systems interrelate, and I think that is sort of what separates an understanding of biology, understanding of pathophysiology, is when you can step out of like a silo and look at the interrelationships. And like today, I think we're going to talk really about that gut-brain connection and just brain inflammation connection.
Yes, and so important.
Yeah, so maybe we could just set a little bit of this discussion up, because I think there's a lot of complexities, and my listeners are people who are really kind of advanced knowledge in health, people who are struggling with conditions similar to the ones that we're talking about, and also new practitioners. So people have a basic understanding of what we're talking about. But I think, maybe to hear some of the core components of this discussion, such as like, what are glial cells? And I think let's start with that.
Well, microglial cells are basically the immune cells of your brain, and they're supposed to be at rest. So your glial cells aren't supposed to be working very hard. The issue is when they get activated by some sort of stressor or trauma, and that could be, it could be vaccination in some population of people. It could be toxic metals. It could be a vector. It could be mycotoxins or mold. It could be stress that triggers it over time. But basically, it could be a head trauma, right? I mean, But basically, when the microglial cells get turned on, so there are these immune trafficking cells saying there is trouble in the brain. When that gets turned on, the issue is that it starts to create a lot of oxidative damage. Your body, your brain starts to produce a whole bunch of free radicals that really end up damaging your neurons. And with this neuronal death, you get the release of these particles from the neurons, things like laminin and neurolaminin, which then actually turn the microglial cells on more. So you get this vicious loop of neuroactivation that is triggering inflammatory signaling that is damaging neuronal tissue and causing what's called dendritic retraction, right? The dendrites retract in and can no longer signal. And then you're damaging these tissues, perpetuating that damage.
Okay. So when we kind of think about that, there's sort of a scenario where people would think, well, I thought the brain was protected from the rest of the body, right? We thought it was sort of like sealed off.
Yeah.
So,
right.
Can we talk about that and how that's changed?
Well, that's so appropriate because you know what? You have three critical barriers in the body, right? You have the blood-brain barrier, you have the epithelial lining of the intestine, and you have the endothelial lining in the inside of your arteries. All of them are one cell layer thick, just one cell layer thick. And so so things can pass through the barriers, like the blood-brain barrier, as it gets damaged under inflammatory response in your body. So your blood-brain barrier gets leaky. One of the classic ones, I don't know if you ever heard of Sam Queen, but Sam Queen was a big forerunner in mercury toxicity and showed that as toxicity due to metals went up, the leakiness of the blood-brain barrier also went up. And so you would measure that through looking at beta-2 microglobulin, right? So if beta-2 microglobulin, it goes above 2, now you know that there's some porousness to that blood-brain barrier. And so the big one that I try to get people to understand today is the concept of lipopolysaccharide being one of the big insults to the brain because it crosses the blood-brain barrier. The problem with lipopolysaccharide is it can be absorbed through the cell and can trigger inflammatory activity that will turn your glial cells on. And you also have receptors for lipopolysaccharide on those blood-brain barrier cells. So it can hit the receptor and start to turn on that inflammatory response. And why is lipopolysaccharide so important? Because it comes from the gut. And this isn't even talking about the whole enteric nervous system and the gut-brain connection, with the nervous system. This is just the straight effect of circulating endotoxin. I remember seeing the first circulating endothelial cell that was stained that was showing that it released inflammatory compounds. And what did that tell us? That's a metastatic model for endothelial dysfunction or for heart disease. Same thing with your other barriers. When you're releasing these kind of compounds and they're traveling distally, they can attach and then they start to trigger their havoc. So the blood-brain barrier gets compromised.
Yeah, so that's really interesting because we think about the origins of LPS and it's from the cell walls of bacteria, right?
Right.
So the original research on brain inflammation was actually infectious, right?
That's right. Exactly. Yeah, but I mean, now we think of LPS, and really the issue with LPS is, as your gut is getting compromised, meaning you could have reduced blood flow to your gut. Maybe you're diabetic, and because your blood pressure's up, you're not getting enough blood flow to your gut. That can kill the bad bug. That can kill the bugs. So bacteria can die off, and your liver and lymph are normally supposed to filter lipopolysaccharide. Mm-hmm. But what they've discovered is that it's interesting, right? the higher the lipopolysaccharide in circulating, for example, the more the symptoms of metabolic syndrome occur.
Wow.
So you become pre-diabetic, you become pre-hypertensive, you become obese, you have all the complications of diabetes. And that's the American Diabetes Journal, right? American Diabetes Association Journal published that a decade ago. And we're still not figuring out how to help diabetics have a healthier microbiome, right? And so now we're seeing that lipopolysaccharide attaches to nearly every tissue and organ. So when you think of multi-organ failure in heart failure, so other organs are failing, the current theory is it's because of the amount of lipopolysaccharide is attaching not just to the heart and causing NF-kappa B to get activated, which triggers COX-2 and triggers other inflammatory cytokines to create damage in the tissue, but it's attaching to the liver, it's attaching to the kidneys, it's attaching to peripheral tissues and wreaking havoc, including on the brain. So lipopolysaccharide, even though it's not infectious, it's a big issue. And I kind of got on a journey of lipopolysaccharide. Is part of my institute in Ohio, we had a spectrum disorder clinic, and so we had kids with brains on fire. And so I was looking around trying to figure out, well, how can we put brains on fire out, right? How do we downregulate microglial cells? So I started working on this nasal spray that was one ginsenoside called R.Ph ginsenoside, because it had all this literature on downregulating microglial activity. And we ended up being able to put it in a nasal spray and give it to individuals. We got about 40,000 people in post-surveillance now, where a whole variety of things from post-stroke to diabetes, memory loss, lots of different improvement, because we're targeting that downregulation of glial cells due to lipopolysaccharide. So
that's synapsin that you're referring to?
That's right.
Yeah, I want to spend some time talking about synapsin, in just a moment here, because I've had some great clinical experience with it, and
good.
It's just been a treasure of a find for a lot of patients. So
I'm glad to hear that. That's great.
Thank you for formulating that, and I want to spend some time with that in a little bit here.
Sure.
It's funny, we have all these acronyms, with these days with like MTHFR and LPS, and just for levity, one of my patients told me there's a really good one going around the internet about LPS now. And I won't actually say it. I'll abbreviate it. Little pieces of filament.
Yeah, there you go. That's kind of it. I mean, that's kind of it.
Yeah.
It's lipopolysaccharide for me, I started talking about it about 15 years ago, and everybody was looking at me like, what are you talking about? And the literature was pretty clear that, because the other term for lipopolysaccharide is endotoxin, right? Same term. But the literature was pretty clear even back then that lipopolysaccharide, or circulating endotoxin, was a reason for a lot of coronary events, a lot of cerebrovascular events. And look, infection, you think of the Lyme patient or the Lyme related illness patient or the biotoxin patient, where they are getting, somewhat assaulted by viral bacterial loads. They have a ton of neurologic symptoms, right? Everything from seizure to panic to anxiety to, insomnia, which insomnia in and of itself is a hyperarousal disorder of the brain, which a lot of people don't realize. I mean, your brain is turned on too much, too long, which leads to neuroinflammation, which means your glial cells are going to be jacked up. Mm-hmm. So, there's all these threads that kind of lead us back to why neuroinflammation is so important, because we see all these symptoms clustering together.
Yeah. So there's another kind of cell to talk about, I think, that might be connected a little bit more to some of the other symptoms, like astrocytes. Are they involved with this inflammation as well?
Oh, absolutely. Astrocytes are really responsible for driving a lot of immune signaling as well. So, it's another kind of partner in the kind of that either that orchestra of keeping your brain from accelerating damage, right? Because as soon as you turn on inflammation, neuroinflammation, you start to create signaling that's going to do things like shrink your hippocampus, cause dendrites to retract. And so the astrocytes are intimately involved in signal in crosstalk with glial cells.
And also like glutamate, right?
Russell Blaylock's work, Excitotoxins, right? That book 20 plus years ago, that was a great book. So it's that whole thing of excessive glutaminergic drive leads to, the calcium ion channels and in the NMDA bridge breaking and creating excitatory chemistry in that neuron. So glutamate, histamine's the other big one. Nobody's talking about histamine in the brain. So as soon as somebody tells me, oh, I sleep great on antihistamine, I know their brain is on fire, right? And histamine is way more than mastocytosis, right? That's the other big term going out now. It's literally what's happening with people is their histamine gene expressions being turned on virtually in all their cells. And so I think it's important for people to kind of get this feeling of understanding that you've got excitatory neurochemistry and inhibitory neurochemistry in your brain. And excitotoxic responses like phenylethylamine, excessive phenylethylamine stimulation causing perseveration. That is excitatory and excitotoxic, just as histamine and glutamate is.
Yeah, that's phenomenal. I mean, I think, if you've ever treated like all of us have helped people, who are struggling with insomnia, if the traditional things don't work, you have to kind of look at neuroinflammation as a cause.
You know what? I'll never forget this one patient who came to me and basically only slept 2 hours a night for years. And I did everything, right? I'm giving her all the stuff to do for sleep. And hey, you got to meditate and, calm down, all that stuff. I end up listening to her one day. And I said, so what do you do before you go to bed? She said, what do you mean? I said, well, I just want to know what you do to go to bed. And then she said, well, every night I have a little sandwich because I'm hungry. I eat a ham sandwich. And I went, eat a ham sandwich before you go to bed every night. Let's do a food allergy panel. We do a food allergy panel on what hits pork.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
I take her off the ham. She sleeps.
Yeah.
Yeah. That, and there were some other ones too. But the big thing was, no, it wasn't gluten in her case, even though now it's almost always gluten as a piece of the inflammatory puzzle for the brain. But in her case, I got her off the ham and all of a sudden she's sleeping through the night. And I think we have to appreciate that fact that reactions that are going on anywhere in the body, but in particular in the gut, have a dramatic effect on what's going on in the brain, right? That's that whole enteric nervous system and the crosstalk between the gut and the brain back to the gut. And when we have excessive excitatory stimulus, right, we're ramping up those enterochromaffin cells because of excess sympathetic drive and excitotoxic drive. We're going to create mast cell activation, create gut permeability, create more lipopolysaccharide, because as the gut gets permeable, you're going to make more LPS and you're going to make more TMAO, which are both going to be very inflammatory. TMAO being trimethylamine oxide, which comes from people overeating meat. And look, eating ketogenic is very popular these days, but there's plenty of literature that says if you go ketogenic too long, it contributes to increasing circulating endotoxin.
Yeah. And I think, I want to introduce or kind of refresh a concept about neuroinflammation. So just so I'm clear, but it seems as though, the body is designed to deal with an occasional insult of this form, like, the brain is, I should say.
Right.
Where, the microglial cells get activated and stabilize the environment.
Right.
And then, but it's that this stream of insult is on 24/7 in these scenarios.
Well, no, that's that whole concept, like the new term, which I wish I invented this term. The new term. I really do. It'd be the best. It's going to be the topic. My next metabolic code book, Metabolic Code 2.0, is going to have this in it. It's going to have the term right in the cover. metaflammation.
Okay.
Metabolic inflammation. Metaflammation is exactly what you said. Your body is built to have an acute response, rectify that response, and restore to homeostasis.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the problem is that if we get into a chronic response, meaning I'm under stress, I'm not sleeping, I'm eating the wrong foods, which basically way too many people eat too much, they eat too often, they eat too late, they're under a lot of stress, they don't get enough sleep, and they don't move.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, before we start talking about pesticides and metals and being bit by a tick and all the other stuff that we look at, right? I mean, let's face it. And then they're put on drug therapy that disrupts the microbiome. That's my latest database that we're putting together right now is drug-induced microbiome disruption.
Wow.
So the point being is that when you don't resolve the inflammation, and this is in lots of papers now, all right? So this is not the world according to Jim. There's several steps that start to happen. One is you start to make more bad lipids. So as soon as people start making bad lipids, you start seeing lots of ox-LDL, oxidized LDL. For those of you who don't know ox-LDL, oxidized LDL, your myeloperoxidase goes up, which is the enzyme that drives it. You make more lipoprotein little a, you make more apolipoprotein B. When you see a shift from relatively healthy lipids to really nasty lipids, you're probably in a state of metaflammation. The next thing that happens, and I bet you see this all the time, that you raise your hepcidin levels and it lowers your ferroportin levels. So what you see in practice is people with normal irons and no ferritin. And when they have no ferritin, they can't stimulate EPO, so they don't really have a healthy red blood cell count, and their platelets are tending to trend low. And that's kind of a hallmark trait with metaflammation. Normal iron in the face of almost no ferritin, so they can't store it because the inflammation has altered the signaling of how you store your ferritin.
Wow. And ferritin also is linked to glutathione, right? As far as glutathione production.
Exactly. And you have to have adequate ferritin for thyroid hormone to bind into the inner cell membrane and actually activate OXPHOS. I mean, how you burn fat. And so that's step one. The next step is that insulin receptors get turned off. One of the books I wrote, where is it? On this side, that book up top, that book was called Diabetes and Cancer, Epidemiologic Links and Molecular Evidence. That was a chapter I wrote in that book. It was a medical textbook. And it turns out that as people get more metabolically inflamed, their insulin receptors either retract or become sluggish. And what happens then is you get into what's called the Warburg effect, where you're passively bringing glucose in, you're creating a bunch of lactate and pyruvate, the cell gets acidotic, you only make 2 molecules of ATP, and now you're fatigued, and your muscles are achy. So that's the next step that happens in the metaflammation model. And then it starts to get really interesting. You get bone loss because of it. And we're seeing more and more men that are osteopenic, where it used to be exclusively a Asian or small blue-eyed Caucasian woman that would be, with osteoporosis. Now we're seeing it in both sexes. But more importantly, the last phases of this process of metaflammation is the loss of neuroplasticity and neuroregeneration. And then the other piece to it is mitochondriopathies, where the mitochondria become ragged and we lose our NAD to NADH ratio that keeps our cells making energy. And of course, when your NAD to NADH ratio goes down, and say you get hit with a virus, just like what happened in the pandemic, your PPAR enzymes can't activate, and now you have cytokine storms. So with people with metaflammation, they end up with a dramatic push towards inflammatory cytokines, both in the brain and peripherally, that are uncontrolled, damaging tissues, and losing neuroplasticity and neuroregenerative capacity. That and that term is associated with the term inflammatory aging. So metaflammation, inflammaging. I don't care who you are, what you're struggling with. at the cellular level, that's what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because as you're talking through that continuum, that process, it really does bring to light the people who, really suffered with severe COVID, and the setup and the precursor to that. And then also some of the things that we're seeing with long haulers or long COVID.
Absolutely.
Before we leave this kind of background aspect, I would like just to kind of, you've talked about so many drivers of the meta inflammation. When you just talked about, I want to just run it by you because there's a lot of information out there about just chronic viruses also being a driver for neuroinflammation. So we have, HHV6, CMV, I don't know if EBV. Yeah.
Sure.
So this is also impacting neuroinflammation, correct?
Absolutely. So once again, like when I think of neuroinflammation, I think it can be a vector. So a vector could be a virus. It could be a protozoa, because protozoas can actually even do it. It could be bacteria. It could be a fragment, right? It could be fungus, right? You can think of people with candida. They have a lot of neuroinflammation. And the reason they have a lot of neuroinflammation is they make a lot of acetaldehyde, which ends up triggering phenolic compounds in their brain versus making neurochemicals, which triggers a lot of quinolinic acid, beta carboline, salsolinol. All these different chemicals start getting made in your brain when you have candida. And that's why you're foggy and you're histaminic and you're dermatographic and you end up with food allergies, as part of that milieu. So it can be vectors, it could be toxins, it can be heavy metals. So I really think, now the one thing I'll say is sometimes when people have, say, for example, chronic inflammatory response syndrome, CIRS, right? So sometimes when they have CIRS, they may test on an antibody test or a whole bunch of stuff. But what it is that their whole immune system is kind of running in chaos. And we may or may not be getting truly positive, we could be getting false positive information. Mm-hmm. And so I always try to define, well, where are they at in their continuum of their immune system so that we're not chasing down potentially a bunch of phantom bugs, whether it's viral or the Lyme-related, Ehrlichia, Babesia, Bartonella, experience. Let's make sure that we're not in an immune system that's just ultimately confused. Cool that down by getting rid of some of the inflammagens that have been produced, the metalloproteinases and such, and the inflammasomes, so like NLRP3 and that kind of stuff. Like suck that stuff out of there, and then let's see where your test lands. And so that's kind of the way I've over the last few years have looked at that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me from a standpoint of the immune system being confused and sort of just reacting and firing at everything, it's and sort of trying to figure out what is the actual vector and trying to stabilize. And so that makes a lot of sense that in those scenarios that, the goal would be to just like really help the immune system be stable and balanced.
Yes.
It reminds me also of like, you see sometimes people do those food allergy tests or food, like food sensitivity testing. And I'm not a huge fan of those, but, sometimes you'll see that all like 72 foods will be off the charts reactive. And it's impossible, for that person to have, true reactions to that many foods, but it does show you that their immune system or their gut or something is inflamed, right?
Yeah, I think the information is valuable. And where I do like kind of the innovations now in kind of that area of food testing is more along the IgG4 epitope and the C3BD epitope, like that screening of the complement side of the reaction to the food, because that's where it gets a lot more granular and less false positives. But if you're just going off of IgG, it's the wild, wild west. That's just not going to give you what you need, other than, like you said, you pretty know somebody's got a leaky gut. They got gut permeability issues. And, when I talked about gut permeability issues back in 1987, people were looking at me like, what are you talking about? Gut permeability. Just lucky to have a great naturopath teacher who taught in Baden-Baden in Germany. They were talking about leaky gut in the 70s, And so the point being is I like that IgG4 because it's produced in order to block the IgE epitope. Mm-hmm. So it's an interesting characteristic. And the C3BD, I think, is interesting. And so I do them. I do them as a part of the plan only because most of the people that you and I are working on, they have got so much inflammation. If you think of them being a trough of inflammation, I'm just trying to figure a bucket that I can pull out of there and dump some of that inflammation out of the body. And so whether that's using, okra as a binder, or do I detoxify with metals? Do I take them off of foods that are really at least the big foods, right? The ones we know are a problem. Started doing that kind of low allergen, anti-inflammatory, modified low carb diet. God, that was a 1986 variant that we've continued to refine. And then naturally, sometimes people need to be on a higher fat diet, depending on what their situation is, if it's a cancer or epilepsy or something like that. But the point being is we kind of got to look and figure out what can we do. I mean, the way, like you mentioned, my metabolic code platform, the whole genesis of that was to try to point people in the direction of where do you need to start to get somebody to start to feel better. Because in the end, people come to us and they need help. They've been to a bunch of people. They don't feel good. They spent a ton of money already. And for me, it's really important to get wins quick, like to gain their confidence back in the process and mainly to give them hope. And I think if you're not looking at neuroinflammation as like at the center of what you should be trying to do, because when you calm people down, they're less panicked, right? They're not as swollen. They don't have as much lymph congestion. They sleep better. All those things I think are key.
Yeah, I love that approach. I mean, I think, there's so many problems you can help stabilize. And then while you're working on the, kind of core issues, and, so I think it shows whenever I hear an experienced clinician talk about that, it's really validating because, people have to feel better and feel some hope to be able to work on the core issues.
100%, man. I can tell you right now, I know so many people that people always say to me, how do you don't advertise? I've never advertised for my practice, not once. Mm-hmm. And I was processing close to 400 people a week in Cincinnati.
Wow.
So we had big clinics, and and people say, how do you do it? And I said, it's real simple. I look for where I can get a win in the first visit.
Yeah.
I want to get somebody to feel better and them to feel hope. And then we're going to work on the deep hard stuff together, and they'll commit. People will commit to get better, but you got to show them you know what you're doing. Yeah.
That's interesting. One of the legends in naturopathic medicine, I don't know if you remember the late Dr. Bill Mitchell.
Sure.
That was one of his tenets. Is exactly that.
Yeah.
So, I think it'd be good to talk a little bit before we conclude about any kind of other lab testing or evaluations that can be done to sort of prove that neuroinflammation is there. I mean, I think sometimes it's like you've seen enough of it, you can call it by just the symptoms, but a lot of times people are looking for like a lab test or.
Sure.
Are there any markers that can be run like on basic panels? And
yeah, I mean, I think if you look at something like MPV, mean platelet volume, mean platelet volume is tied to metaflammation. So as mean platelet volume goes up and you're approaching the upper limits of normal, or you go out of bounds, you can be sure that there's a metabolic inflammatory response. And look, once there's metaflammation, neuroinflammation's involved by default. It's there. So that's one easy test that you can look at is an MPV. Mm-hmm. The other thing I really like is looking at white blood cell differentials, and nobody really pays attention to white blood cell differentials, but it's clear that when your monocytes, eosinophils, and basophils are up, I mean, when basophils go above 1, you have elevated IL-6. I mean, it's going to be there. And interleukin 6 is one of the big players in neuroinflammation, right? I mean, that when you upregulate IL-6 in the brain, it triggers claudin 2 in your epithelial cell in your intestine, right? So as your IL-6 goes up, it signals that epithelial cell in the intestine to activate the claudin 2 receptor, and claudin 2 gets upregulated, and that's what breaks the tight junctions between the epithelial cells. That mesh, that tight junction glycoproteins wither and fall as IL-6 upregulates and claudin 2 gets activated. So a real good one for that is basophils over 1. And then, of course, if your monocytes, eosinophils, and basophils really add up, the percent adds up to above. I used to try to get people to get to 7. It's nearly impossible nowadays because everybody's so darn reactive. But if I can keep them down around 9, they're in good shape. But as you approach the teens, as people have a 14, like an 11 monocyte, a 5 eosinophil, eosinophils, they used to be out of bounds at 2.5. And then so many people got reactive that they moved it up to 7. It's like everybody's got an eosinophil problem. So we'll just raise the level to make everybody normal, which is the problem with labs, right? I mean, what is the real norm? Because it floats depending how sick the whole population is. Yeah. So the point being is MEBs, I think, are really great. Now, you can order things like OxLDL. You could get a deoxyguanosine, because for me, deoxyguanosine is probably one of the most important markers to look at, because 8-OHDG tells you if you're damaging your DNA. And if you're damaging your DNA, you are sending signals from the brain down that there's inflammation going on. So that's an easy one to do. And then some simple things, I think, just looking at, you can look at IL-6, you can look at MMP9, you can look at VEGF. I mean, any of these markers can show you, and you can get them on a normal blood panel. I mean, you can order VEGF from just about anybody. And it's kind of interesting. If VEGF is really high, it's kind of colitis kind of stuff, right? And risk for colon cancer. If it's really low, that's where the immune system's really compromised, and you've got that chronic inflammatory response activity that is being driven by the brain. Melanocyte stimulating hormone, right? It helps to kind of characterize melanocortin in your brain. And so if you get an MESH down in the 20s or below, typically that means your brain's on fire. Is that a direct correlation? No, but we're still kind of, I would say, in the primitive state. I mean, one of the things I did about, 15 years ago was I measured I did what was a functional MRI on people. And basically I labeled their brain with diazepam. And what I showed was their glutamate to acetylcholine activity, right? Because as glutamate goes up, acetylcholine goes down, I'm gonna have memory loss. So I took 5 men, 5 women, cross-matched, 55 to 70 years of age, none on medications, but all complaining of some short-term memory issues. And all I did for 30 days was I gave them an antioxidant vitamin, and I gave them phosphatidylcholine.
Okay.
That's all I did.
Yeah.
Guess what happened in 30 days on a rescan? The choline went up, glutamate went down, and 8 out of 10 people said they had a significant improvement in the way their brain felt and the way they were processing their memory. So there's some really cool stuff you can do that's pretty simple. So that's if you can image and do some things. But the lab tests, I'll tell you what, look around. I mean, obviously the other one, it's really simple. When you have elevated insulin, a high insulin is going to mean there's a lot of inflammation systemically in an individual. Yeah.
Well, so getting to, you're kind of talking about some of the things you've been involved with helping with neuroinflammation. So I'm glad you said that, like, one of the things you like to do is help people feel better, in kind of the short term as you're working on all these core issues. That brings to mind the synapsin. And, like, if you could talk us through that formula a little bit, because
sure.
I think there's a few more aspects to it that I'd love to hear about. Sure. Why is that kind of your neuroinflammatory go-to?
Well, I mean, so, basically what happened was I was at the University of Cincinnati teaching a course called Survey in Natural Medicine. A lead professor of herbology from Beijing University was visiting, and he sent me, threw me these pills, and he said, "Hey, this is good for the brain." And it was RG3 in a little pellet. And I kind of looked at it and went, "Ah, yeah, what do you know? I'm this, I'm teaching this. I'm hot stuff, right? Young guy." So, I'm, totally blew it off. Well, then I'm starting to work 5 years later in our autism and spectrum disorder side of our institute with my lead doctor, Dr. Pelletier. And I said, I got to find out how to turn off microglial cells. So I start doing primary lit review, and this RG3 keeps coming up, and I'm going, why do I remember this? I go in my closet at home, and I still got the bottle from 5 years ago, RG3 ginsenoside. Turns out it's the most rare ginsenoside, and you have to ferment it. So it's very expensive to get this raw material. It has to be pharmaceutically fermented to get 90+% pure R3 ginsenoside. And so the net of this was that it's the main ingredient, right? What it's doing is it literally has the effect of immune trafficking. It turns off the glial cell activation, but it stimulates neuroregeneration at the same time. So it stimulates BDNF now, and it turns the glial cells off at the same time. So people, and I just was on a phone call with a lady today, 67-year-old woman complaining of memory issues, lots of stress in her life. And she's like, this really helped me. I mean, I'm feeling a difference 1 month later. Mm-hmm. And it's because it's very specific. It improves sodium ion channel transduction, so you get better signaling at the cell membrane. It downregulates NMDA. It protects the NMDA calcium bridge. It neutralizes glutamatergic drive. These are all things that have been shown about R3 ginsenoside. Mm-hmm. So it basically, why I was interested in it is it played almost a harmonic chord of the problems that ensue once you turn the glial cells on. Mm-hmm. Then we added nicotinamide riboside to it.
Yeah.
And the reason for that was to fuel the neuron, right? The neuron needs NAD. And it turns out people go, oh, I just use NAD. Well, if you give NAD by IV, it ends up having to get turned into NR, then recirculated to NAD. And it's the same thing if you give NMN. And NMN has to get turned into NR to be used. So that's, that's kind of the importance of the NAD. And then the third piece is, of course, just using methylcobalamin because what we find out is that energetically, as people are getting older or under a lot of neurologic damage, they use up a lot of their B12, and we want to make sure that gets on board. And then we can alter that by adding things like alpha GPC, which of course is alpha glycerol phosphatidylcholine that crosses the blood-brain barrier really well, and of course doing it intranasally gets right in there. The reason we're doing that is to build acetylcholine, make growth hormone happen, and create neuroregeneration. So it's a pretty. I have to admit, the first time that the big novel thing about that was we figured out how to solubilize it and make it into an intranasal spray, because nobody had figured that out before.
Yeah, and I think for me, like I said, there's been several patients so far that have used it. I personally used it when I was living in a moldy home.
Oh, wow.
It really helped me because I was having that kind of chronic fog
right.
from being exposed to all that mycotoxin, and a blast of that just helped me kind of get some clarity and focus. So yeah, I look forward to continue. We have, God bless the compound pharmacies. They're just doing such amazing work that are putting that together, putting formulas together. Like we use Cussler's and Clark's Pharmacy out here. They formulate the synapsin for us.
Right.
Well, I know you're really busy, and I don't want to go over our time here, but I'd like to just kind of close by just like maybe one or two take-home messages from you, and then just to hear anything that you'd like the audience to know about as far as what you're, kind of what you're focusing on right now, and what
Sure.
how they can follow you.
Sure. So obviously they can go to jimlavelle.com or metaboliccode.com. And I got a bunch of other social media stuff. I got to be honest, I'm 61 years old, so I'm still learning how to do all that stuff.
Yeah.
Luckily, I've been using synapsin, so I still got a couple brain cells firing. But it's kind of a generational thing there.
Yeah, it's how you're doing really good.
Yeah, I'm working it. So I mean, the big takeaway for me is be relentless in your pursuit for the health that you deserve. That it's work. It's work to be well, but it's worth it. You don't have a fine home without working on it. You don't have a car that runs well without working on it. And it's really your responsibility. And us as practitioners, it's our responsibility to deliver the goods on that too. And I know we're not perfect. We're going to have our ups and downs. We're going to fall short here and there. But if we really focus on how do I help that person? Let's get them feeling a little better so I can get them that hope. Man, it makes things work so much better. And that's my big takeaway. And, and obviously, eating better, super important. Managing your stress, super important. When I say eating better, it's obvious. Watch the sat fat, watch the sugar, eat more fiber, don't eat too late. Don't overeat, especially if you're only like walking a half hour a day for your exercise. You don't need a pre-workout, intra-workout, and post-workout drink. Be responsible with that. And then the big thing I'm working on now is just kind of the launch of this whole Metabolic Code platform, because what we're doing is we're taking in the information of how a person feels, what their labs are, how they exercise, what drugs they're on, and so that we can actually see and cluster people into what's really working for this type of person. So almost creating like a digital twin for them that is allowing us to really help practitioners understand what's your best shot at getting somebody to get well. And so I'm working pretty hard on just continuing that methodology of systems biology, breaking things into 5 major archetypic groups. So it's easy to explain to the patient. And it's also easier for the practitioner to kind of get moving, especially if they're new at this. If you're no warhorse at it like I am, I mean, whether or not you need this, it could be probably questionable, right? It's but I would say that even for me, I use it and it streamlines my time. So those are the things I'm working on. I got 2 books coming out this year. I got Cracking the Metabolic Code 2.0. And then I'm actually finishing a book on optimized performance for athletes, because I do a lot of work in addition to with sick folks. Clinical director, Pro Football Hall of Fame, performance health program, and I work with teams and players in all 5 major league sports. So I got a performance book that's really getting people to understand that biomechanics and biochemistry can never not intersect. If you don't have a healthy biochemistry, it's hard to have healthy biomechanics.
Wonderful. Well, if you're up, I'd love to have you come back sometime to talk about some of the book and some of the other topics you're involved with.
Well, I would love to do it. So that was a bunch of fun today.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jim. And we'll let you go, but we really appreciate you being here. This was outstanding.
Great. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.